So this afternoon, I've been pondering on the question of identity. And the more I think about it, the more problematic I find it. Take a moment to consider this. How would you identify you? And indeed, how would you identify anyone? I'll be a guinea pig today, so how would you identify Melvin? And you might say it's very easy. I know how you look like. You have certain defining characteristics, so if I look through a picture, I know you, and if I were in public, in a crowd, I could spot you probably, and maybe that's how some of us might meet in the future. Generally speaking, when we're thinking about identity, when thinking about people's names, we have pictures in our mind, mental images of how they look like, certain defining characteristics, facial features, certain physical properties that they might have. For example, that person might have a scar, he might have a certain look, he might dress in a certain way, but we have this image of them, and we have images of different people, whether they're celebrities, friends, family, strangers. We have built images of them in our mind, and we can easily identify them. And even indeed, towards ourselves, we can identify us. We look into the mirror, and we know that the person that we're looking at right now, that's us. That's me. And so you might think it's very straightforward, but the more that you actually think about it, the more problematic it actually becomes, especially when you think about it more critically. To illustrate this, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus actually told a very interesting parable about the ship of a legendary king of ancient Greece, Theseus. He was born this prince, and in order to prove his birthright, he went on all these naval expeditions, most famously to slay the terrifying creature known as the Minotaur, this half-man, half-beast. And through all these naval expeditions, eventually he proved his worth, and he came back and eventually founded the great city-state of Athens. And his exploits and adventures were so great, and he was so beloved, that the people of Athens actually kept his ship after it was docked, and they built a memorial around it somewhere in the city as a tribute to this great legendary king. Even after when Theseus had passed away, the city kept this memorial and they maintained it really well. So the ship has been there the entire time. But of course, being a wooden ship during those times, as the years passed, parts actually broke down or they rotted. And so being very dedicated and patriotic Athenians, they would maintain the ship and replace those broken parts, mainly the wooden planks with new wooden planks. And so through the years, they've been maintaining it, replacing the broken parts with new parts. Now, Heraclitus asked us this pertinent question. Since the original parts are being replaced, and they have been replaced through the years, meaning that many parts of the ship are actually wooden planks that Theseus and his original crew had never actually interacted with, is it still the same ship? Now, most of us would say, well, certainly yes, it is the same ship, because of course it still has the original parts, and of course things get maintained through time. So it is very much so the original ship. As long as it looks like the original ship, which it does, then it is the Ship of Theseus. Now, what about if 50 or 60 years pass by furthermore? And now the majority of the ship, let's say 80% of the ship, has been replaced with new parts. In other words, the original parts are getting less and lesser. Is it still the Ship of Theseus? At this point, some of us might start to feel a bit strange about this concept. But to really illustrate this, imagine that enough years go by and the entire ship, from every part, has been replaced by new parts. None of the parts in any area and in every corner of the ship has been parts that Theseus has ever interacted with originally. Would we still call that the Ship of Theseus? And at this point, I think most of us would scratch our heads and surrender. It is a very strange concept. Although the idea is that that is the Ship of Theseus, from a physical standpoint, it no longer is the same ship. And that is why Heraclitus came to the conclusion that you can never really step in the same river twice. Because although some of us might say that, let's say this is the Yangtze River, and we could go into it, the body of water that we're stepping into, because of the constant current, is not the same body of water at any given point in time, especially through the years, where even the compositions within water itself might be totally different. Yet we have the idea that this is the Yangtze River, in the same sense that we have the idea that this is the Ship of Theseus. Beyond that, they are not essentially the same things anymore. And indeed, if we were to follow Heraclitus's parable, the conclusion is that the Ship of Theseus is no longer the actual Ship of Theseus, because all the parts have actually changed. And I think that's a reasonable conclusion that most of us could actually accept. But here's where it gets interesting. The human body is constantly transforming, regenerating, and developing its cells. And in fact, every 7 years, our entire body and its cells are actually entirely replaced through this process. In other words, we are very much like the Ship of Theseus. Parts of our bodies are constantly getting maintained and replaced. And every 7 years, technically, our bodies and our physical properties are totally different. For example, if you had a child who's only, let's say, 5 years old, his body, at least in terms of cells, is totally different from the same person's body when they are, let's say, 86. It's been replaced many times over, and if you were to put it side by side, they are technically totally different in terms of their biological properties. Yet, would we still say that this is the same person? The physical properties are constantly changing, and certainly from the perspective of even looks, which is really where we began this inquiry today, we could say definitely a person when they were, let's say, 3 looks totally different from when they are, let's say, 15, 30, and 60. Physical properties are constantly changing for us human beings. So can we really say that they are the source of our identities? Is the current young-looking me compared to the one day older-looking me? And so we can actually see that it's very natural for us to associate physical properties to our identity. This line of reasoning falls very quickly. Now, to really illustrate this, many centuries later, English philosopher Thomas Hobbes actually did a further thought experiment on the Ship of Theseus. In another version of the story, imagine that every time that ship was getting maintained, all the broken down parts were getting replaced and thrown away. A very quaint collector started to actually keep the broken down parts, and eventually, having gathered all of them, assembled another Ship of Theseus, although rotted down, but with the original parts, at another area of the city. And at that point, which one is the actual Ship of Theseus? Is it the one that's been refurbished with brand new parts that looks as amazing as it was on the first day, or is it the broken down looking one with the original parts? At least from a physical comparison, again, we're at a loss for words and a loss of thought as to which one's the actual one. In the same sense that if we were to look at a picture of us in our youth and look into a mirror of ourselves, maybe one day when we're much older, can we still say we're the same person? Is the younger version of us, as we know today, us, or actually the older version of us? And so we can see that although we're very natural to quickly assume that who we are is tied to our physical properties as a source of identity, this line of reasoning is actually very fragile. So in that case, what then is the true source of identity? I think most of us at this point would point towards something more inner, something within ourselves. And indeed, for most part of history, all the way up to the 18th century, most thinkers in this area would say that who we are is actually tied to our soul. The idea that there's something within us that is very different. Of course, the idea of a soul is a very abstract concept that is very metaphysical. It's hard for us to really break that down. And whether we are religious or not, most of us, moving beyond the physical property line of thinking, would believe that there's something within us that defines who we are. And for many thinkers, and I believe maybe you might think that this inner property is our mind. How we think, the opinions that we have, the views that we have, the thought process that we have, that results in our actions every day. That must be the source of our identities, because we feel that these properties might be very unique and very different, very distinct. In other words, you might think that you are who you are besides how you look like, but also because of how you think, how your mind sees the world. And we can be very quick to accept this, but it's also quite problematic, because if you were to define your identity on the basis of the inner properties of your mind, on the basis of the thoughts, the opinions, the views that you might have, are you certain to say that out of the billions of people in the world, that other people might not have those same mental properties as you? Certainly at many points in our lives, we've probably met people who are very similar to us in the way that they actually think. And of course, we instantly feel a connection with these people. But the point being this, as much as we might like to think that we might have a very unique way of actually processing the world through our mind, the very specific things that make up our mind, our opinions, our views, our thinking, other people might share it too. And that alone cannot be the basis of our identity. And also it presents a second issue, which is that what if these properties that you said are very unique to you changes? What if we start to change our views of the world? Of course, we've heard stories of, for example, certain criminals who become born-again Christians, fundamental transformations in their minds. Are they still the same person? And so you see, applying the idea of mental properties as a source of identity is also problematic. But it seems to be that we're in the right direction. There is something internal that must be the source of it. Well, according to English philosopher John Locke, it isn't just the thinking that makes us who we are. It is actually the continuity of thinking that makes us unique. What Locke is really talking about is the fact that it isn't just what we're thinking today, but the fact that our thinking today is a continuation of our thinking yesterday, the day before, the weeks before, the months before, the years before, and there has been this continuation of thought that is very unique, that makes us who we are. In other words, our memories. And that although we might share certain similar thoughts to certain people any given day, we might develop certain habits that's similar to certain people mentally speaking, but at least the continuation of our journey of thought through time might be very, very different. And that must be, according to Locke, the source of our personal identities. So although our physical properties might be changing, that we might be aging, our bodies might not be the same bodies that we have, there has been a continuation of thought through time. And although the vehicle is very different, there has been a narrative that's been developing through time. And this idea of the continuity of thinking does give us a more reasonable solution to the problem of identity that we've talked about so far. Yet it isn't the ultimate solution, especially if you were to look at it from the aspect known as the transitivity of identity. See, you might say that who you are today, mentally speaking, is a continuation of your thought 10 years ago. At least you can trace it back to that, so you can remember your memories from 10 years ago. And that person 10 years ago is a continuation of the thoughts from 20 years ago, and the person 20 years ago, a continuation from 30 years ago. And so you can say there's a continuation through time. But if you were really to look at it, Locke's argument of continuity only presents a very easy way of looking at a narrative through time. But realistically speaking, whoever you are today, mentally speaking, at this point of your life, if you were to directly compare it to who you are when you were only, let's say, 6, 7, or 8, mentally speaking, we're talking about two people who are entirely different, at least by their mental properties. You could try and explain that as been a narrative through time, but the fact is, most of us, we might not have that good of a continuation of our narratives through time. A lot of us might be very good at remembering things, but generally speaking, there are a lot of memories that are lost through time, and there's been no actual continuation through time. So at least when you're looking at it from the perspective of transitivity, the realistic thing is this: who you are right now at this point in your life, compare that to a person maybe more than 15, 16, 17, 18 years ago. Mentally speaking, we are talking about two very different people. Your interests might be totally different. The way you think about the world, the way you see the world, your thought process, all that could be totally different. And also not to mention, physically, you would also be totally different. So are you still the same person? So as we can see through all these different considerations, identity is really a perplexing concept. Who are we, if not our bodies and our minds? Are we actually different people at every point in time? And the idea of identity, just a concept that we have conceived to make sense of the potentiality that we might be different individuals existing ever present in different moments of time. And that's why I call this the problem of identity. From this perspective, and very interesting at least in this area, still today, great debates are being had about what actually makes us us. And so from this angle, I can certainly see why it is maybe convenience and almost a natural conclusion to believe in a so, but also perhaps why it is a necessity to do so. So next time when you look into the mirror, think about this: what makes you you?